webinar. This is a webinar dedicated to the economics of cybersecurity, entitled Research on the Economics of Cybersecurity. And you will see that the subject is maybe even much more complex than even insurer and reinsurer are thinking about. Of course, it's a very hot topic. It's not an up-to-date topic. Is also a very highly hot topic. This webinar is hosted by Kim Kaivanto, senior lecturer in economics and the director of the MSc Master in Money, Banking and Finance at Lancaster University Management School. Thank you so much, Kim, to have accepted to host this webinar, especially considering recent events that have deeply affected your family, and we are all with you and your family. Cybersecurity has been characterized, it's at least what you say, Kim, and I just confirm what you say, as the interdisciplinary field at the intersection of economics, psychology, and technology. In this webinar, Kim Kaivanto will discuss a cross-section of normative and behavioral economics research results on cybersecurity. A key question for every chief information security officer, maybe also data officer, is how much should we spend on information security? Classical models provide a framework for answering questions pertaining to optimal expenditure on information uncertainty and information security. A more complete approach recognizes that information security investments create externalities and also trade-offs between different stakeholder groups. Furthermore, psychology-inspired behavioral economics models of susceptibility to cyber attack and to system-level cyber breach risk are also part of this more complete approach. Finally, one can turn to the systemic level and ask questions about the potential of cyber attacks to constitute or to trigger systemic risk events in the financial system, because they are affecting all the dimension of our human societies, which are all more or less dependent from information technology. Before joining LUMS, Kim Kaivanto held fellowship at the Eton Berklas School of Economics and Warwick Business School, from where he received his PhD. Kim's research interests are theoretical and descriptive models of decision-making and behavior under risk and uncertainty. He has applied his expertise to problems such as prediction markets for climate risk, investor sentiment, security behavior, civil aerospace, R&D, support schemes, aviation slot allocation, and CO2 emissions, venture capital, and the exploitation of social science research. He has also advised the banking sector on climate risk exposure. Together with Mark Ruston, they lead the crucial research projects funded by the SCOR Foundation, Climate Risk and Uncertainty Collective Intelligence Laboratory. And those who have been participating to the workshop in London, presented by Mark and by Kim, have been able to appreciate their knowledge, their in-depth research capacities. Before giving you the floor, Kim, let me remind to the auditors that the webinar will last maximum 1.5 hours, and that you will have the opportunity, that the auditors will have the opportunity to ask their question at the end of the presentation of Kim, except if you have a purely technical understanding question that you will be allowed to ask during the presentation. Kim, the floor is yours for the time you need for it, depending on you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Philippe, and thank you for your SCOR colleagues for showing up on such short notice to listen to this talk that spans quite a few years of my research and touches upon areas that I happen to teach in our Cyber Executive MBA at Lancaster University. I understand that this is a topic that is of great relevance to the insurance sector, insofar as cyber insurance is a growing, developing field, far from mature, and therefore can benefit from inputs of various kinds. Hopefully, what I share today will be of some relevance and spark some ideas. But I think this is more on the research side rather than the applied pricing of cybersecurity side. So without further ado, I hope you don't mind if we launch into a PowerPoint. Hopefully the technology here works as intended. So you should now be seeing shortly a full screen presentation. Is that coming through?
Yeah, great. It's great.
Okay, and thank you. And so Zhiying and Philippe, would you mind letting me know if someone has their hand up, as I have only a small screen here with that sort of information. So please do just speak through and don't hesitate to interrupt me if someone wants my attention.
Okay, we'll do that.
Excellent. Thank you. So, okay, I should be getting into the first slide. So Philippe went through our abstract for today's presentation, and I am going to be sticking more or less to that structure that outlined in the abstract. First, starting with the questions that is at the top of the mind of every chief information security officer: how much should we be spending on information security or protecting our information? We'll go from there into a couple of individual level actor models that then we aggregate up to what I call the system level or the organization level to draw inferences about the risk exposure of an organization given different modeling assumptions about the decision making of the people in the organization. And finally, we'll go up to one level higher than that. We'll look at the nation state's systemic risk in the financial sector specifically. So beginning with this original CSIO question. Now, this question has been addressed in the economic sphere now for just over 20 years, and there is a core model by Gordon and Loeb from 2002 that is the basis for much modeling. And I will just introduce you to the core structure of that model and a little bit, show you some of the ways in which we solve that and use that model, really from a very elementary base. And for the rest of the papers that I'm going to be discussing, I'm not going to be going into great mathematical or analytical detail. I want to give you the overall picture of the structure of the models and the structure of the experiments and simulations, and then the results and associated implications of these modeling and experimental exercises. So this is not pedagogical in that sense. It's more to give you an overview of the kinds of results that exist in economics and economics and stroke behavioral economics, because as Philippe mentioned, there is a general acceptance among people who study this area that if you approach only with one tool set, let's say the tool set of an economist, or only with the tool set of a technologist, or only the tool set of a psychologist, you will be missing out. And your analysis will be detrimentally incomplete. So we are now combining inputs, combining elements of those three different areas: psychology, economics, and technology. To begin with, the Gordon and Loeb model. It's the title of this paper is The Economics of Information Security and Investment, and the paper does really warrant that title. It is really the basis for much of the work in economics around this topic. Of course, there is a community of researchers who attend an annual conference called WISE, Workshop on the Economics of Information Security. And if you are interested in this area, checking through the agenda for that conference and perhaps the papers and proceedings of that conference is a really good place to get a good overview of the field and see all of the various, for instance, game theoretic work that's going on in the area to complement and build on top of the Gordon and Loeb core model. So what are the elements of this model? Several variables. We have to go through those to identify and build on top of. So first of all, we identify a variable Z, the amount of money spent on information security by the firm. Capital L represents the potential losses in financial terms from a breach of the information set. This could be in the form of penalties, fines levied by the nation state or by the European Union, or it could be direct losses from losing control of the information. V represents vulnerability. You could think of this as a probability. It ranges from 0 to 1, where 0 represents 0 probability of breach, and V equaling 1 representing certainty of breach if attempted. But this V vulnerability variable represents the vulnerability of the firm's information set prior to any protective investment Z. The product of V and L is the expected loss in the absence of any information security investment. And now we come to the first complicated expression. So the function S of the variables V, the base level vulnerability, and Z, the amount invested in information security, is what we call the security breach probability function. This provides a probability of breach conditional upon the starting level of vulnerability and the amount of information security investment. This is really the key operationalization of it within the model. And we will see that there are several functional forms for this security breach probability function, and results depend very much on the form of this function. And it's important for applications of this model to really bring that function to, into close proximity with the actuality of information security within the firm. So this is the key function that needs to be fit to the reality on the ground of the firm. Finally, EBIS, the expected benefit from information security investment, is simply the expected reduction in expected loss associated with the information security investment Z. Now, I've chosen a particularly simple representation so that we can show visually how we solve this model. We do it typically by calculus, but if we have this visual representation, what we do is we equalize the marginal cost of investment. And here, given that we have Z on the horizontal axis, the amount spent on information security protection is on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, you have expected costs, expected benefits. Then the slope of that cost of investment line is precisely the marginal cost of protection. And of course, the tangent to the EBIS curve is the marginal benefit of information security investment. And so we equalize the marginal benefit with marginal cost. And this is our typical solution concept that we use in most of economics. And it applies to in this model. And it's fortunately fairly simple, so we can represent it in this stylized fashion. Now, we can go further than that. We can make some inferences about the amount in terms of the proportion of expected losses that we should be expecting to pay as information security protection. Now, there are several functional forms for that security breach probability function, and I've got two there listed at the top. One of which is a 2-parameter version with alpha and beta greater than 0 being parameters, and a simpler form on the second line, which only requires 1 parameter. Now, regardless of whether we use one of those functional forms, or indeed one of a member of a large class of other related security breach probability functions that have been studied in the literature, there is a common partial solution to this problem, namely that under no circumstances should a firm be paying more than the inverse of the Euler number times the expected loss to protect its information assets. So you have an upper bound on the optimal information security investment of 37%. Now, 37% is quite a large figure, but it is reassuring that there is this mathematical hard upper bound. And this is not saying that one can be justified in paying up to 37%. I think that's the wrong way to phrase it, because here we're not saying anything about the particular parameters involved in those security breach probability functions. In fact, to be able to say anything more than paying 37% or more is irrational, right? Or suboptimal, actually, it's suboptimal. To have a more precise solution, to narrow it down, you really need to fit the security breach probability function to the firm in an econometrically and statistically meaningful way, and use that then to derive a more precise solution. But even without doing that exercise, that statistical or econometric exercise, we do have this partial solution. And as I say, I mean, if you the authors of this paper then went on, they created entire careers off of this one paper, this one model. They've written textbooks on this, so you can read entire textbooks on how to go about choosing an appropriate security breach probability function and applying it to your firm. The losses that were considered in that first cut, that first approach to the model, were private costs. But of course, security breaches have externalities. And So there is an external component to the losses in addition to the private component. And Gordon and Loeb also solved their model for the case where the social costs are additive, are the additive function of private and external costs. And the solution format in terms of that upper bound is precisely consistent with the result we found for the simpler case. And the caveats that I would like to add here that are more for discussion, to lead to discussion and thought and contemplation, are that this approach that is prevalent through virtually all of economics relies on what we call ensemble averaging. And that is that we posit a large number of parallel universes and take our expectations with regard to the outcomes in those parallel universes. Now, any given individual, or indeed any given firm, isn't interested in its existence in many of those other parallel universes, only the present one. So there's also a movement, a development, also within the insurance industry I have seen, to start considering what are called time averaging solutions to this kind of problem, where you're actually concerned more about avoiding major losses, avoiding bankruptcy, with a little bit more intensity than you would in an ensemble averaging framework. So this is an emergent field that's just getting started, but I do think that it is highly relevant for not only the pricing of insurance, but for understanding customers and clients, insurance seekers, thinking about how much protection they should buy. And that class of models that rely on time averaging and ergodicity economics leads to a whole set of new results, where if I characterize, the individual is more interested in protection than he is under ensemble averaging approaches. Gordon and co-authors have also extended this model to the case of multiple information sets, and there's a nice separability assumption at the heart of the modeling that they do. Basically, they derive a level of cybersecurity investment by allocating funds to protect individual information sets, with that separability assumption being maintained. All the while simply ensuring that the incremental benefits from additional investment are at least as large as the incremental costs of that investment. In other words, it's a marginal benefit equals marginal cost argument at the heart of it. Now, I did mention externalities, that Gordon and co-authors have looked at the case of externalities, but they did so in a fairly simple way. And here I want to lay out a little bit of the complexity that is involved in the externality trade-offs analysis that at least I'm doing in my work. So we can think of different levels and different layers of the problem. One can think of the individual firm's externalities on other members of its supply chain. So a firm can be somewhere embedded in the middle of a long supply chain where you might have, I don't know, let's say a Lockheed Martin Corporation at the top, or an Airbus at the top, and they're somewhere in the middle, all the way down to the suppliers of screws and rivets and simple undifferentiated wiring. Okay, so the firm itself sits within a supply chain, and its decisions over how much to invest in information security affect not only itself, the private benefits, the private losses, but also it affects the supply chain it's within, the other firms within that supply chain, the supply chain of in entirety, as well as firms within its sector outside its own supply chain. And the externalities are not all in the same direction. So if I take the case of firm A under-investing in information security protection, okay, this makes the firm a soft entry point for advanced persistent threats within its supply chain. This means that its supply chain as a whole is experiencing a negative externality. But on the other hand, within that supply chain, because it is the soft target, it is a magnet for attack. So on one level, other firms within the supply chain are less likely to be targeted as entry points into the supply chain. So that's good for them. But on the other hand, the level of protection or the security of the entire supply chain in which those other firms reside is compromised. Okay, so you have a positive externality and a negative externality even within the same supply chain. And with regard to other firms in the sector, but not in the supply chain, those firms that are labeled B and C on the slide, well, they get a positive externality insofar as they are less likely to be targeted than the firm A that's been underinvesting. If we take the contrary suboptimality, that of overinvesting in information security, you again get a cascade of externalities. Positive externality to the supply chain as a whole, right? But a negative one to other members within the supply chain who now are relatively softer targets, more likely to be targeted by APT attackers. And then there is a negative externality from firm A onto other firms B, C, etc., because now they are relatively more soft targets for the attackers. So the externality map, if you like, is rather complicated. And finally, I'd like to mention the effect of industry standards. Now, it's common, at least in the UK, for authorities to be approaching the challenges of information security and cybersecurity within the country through establishing standards, common standards. But there is a point that is not often discussed in this connection, and that is that if there is a hard requirement within a sector to have to reach a certain level of protection, call it X, capital X, then a slight sort of innovation by the attackers to go a little bit beyond the level X established by standard, and I call that level just above the standard level, X plus epsilon on the slide. So if the attackers manage to achieve the ability to penetrate just above that level of X, then in fact they can access the entire sector, right? If everyone has protected themselves up to a particular level, then going slightly above that in terms of technical sophistication gives you complete access across the entire sector. And that is an example of systemic risk. So overall, I'd like to flag here that there are subtle differences between what is good for the country, what is good for the sector, what is good for a particular supply chain, what is good for a particular firm, and indeed what is good for the owners and executives versus the employees in a particular firm. So these the answers to what is optimal, what is the right amount of information security investment, will depend on which of these perspectives one is adopting. I would conclude by saying that yes, there is a role for best practice and standards, but I would also add that there also needs to be discretion and judgment by chief information security officers with regard to whether there's a need to go above what is dictated by the standard or by best practice. And so that concludes my overview of this very famous framework originally developed by Gordon and Loeb. I'd like now to move on to a paper of mine from 2014, where I begin to look at the differences for system level risk. Here I'm thinking of the organization or the firm being the system that we're interested in. So differences in that system level risk or organization level risk from making different modeling assumptions, different modeling frameworks to represent individual level layperson decision making. Okay, because of course not all of us are information security experts. Not all of us are experts in hacking or in the various aspects of social engineering that the hackers use. Most of us are lay users of technology, and therefore our modeling of lay users' behavior should be appropriate to what we scientifically expect of lay users. And in this paper, I take a first stab, make a first attempt at how we should be modeling lay users' decision making. And the answer or the proposal that I put forth in this paper is that we use a prospect theory augmented version of signal detection theory combined with psychology of deception effects. That this is sort of the minimal requirement for being able to model individual level behavior that can then be meaningfully aggregated up to system level risk. So this is a combination of different modeling frameworks. And this paper's main contribution, well, part of its principal contribution is the analytics, the mathematics of how we implement that combination. But I will be skating over those, giving you a rather more emphasis on the structure overall and the implications. Secondly, does it matter whether our modeling assumption reflect normative rationality or a more psychologically informed heuristics and biases approach? The answer is yes, resoundingly yes, at least based on the comparative statics and simulation results that I'll be sharing in a few slides. So, as I already managed to describe in some detail, the core of this model is signal detection theory. Now, signal detection theory has a long history starting in World War II and then picked up and developed by psychologists working on perception and decision making in variety of contexts, and it has a very elegant, simple structure that makes it useful as the core of a theory, a core around which I can build a more elaborate theory. And I'm going to add to that cumulative prospect theory, as well as elements from the phishing and deception literatures that I mentioned earlier. Classical signal detection theory is based on several elements. First of all, a misclassification cost matrix. So for true positives, true negatives, false positives, and false negatives, for each of these, there is a cost associated with it. There's also, we also require in the model some information on base rates, or what you call an evasion setting priors. And there is the possibility of introducing simple expected utility risk preferences as well. But I have to note, and it's really bears noting, that virtually all of the signal detection literature has avoided making much use of risk aversion. In fact, the objective function used for virtually all of signal detection theory literature has been expected value. So minimizing expected costs has been the objective of virtually all of that literature. What I'm doing here is introducing as an objective function cumulative prospect theory, and we're going to rederive the optimal cutoff threshold in signal detection theory using this updated, behaviorally informed objective function of cumulative prospect theory. A little bit on that theory, on cumulative prospect theory. It incorporates several different core central behavioral biases and behavioral anomalies that have been found to be central in much of the behavioral decision-making literature. Of course, cumulative prospect theory was developed by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, and Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for this. I think it was either in 2001 or 2002, if I'm not mistaken. And the biases that this model, this theory incorporates, include reference dependence, framing effects. So reference dependence in the sense that it values deviations from some benchmark, right? Doesn't look at end of horizon, final utility, final portfolio payoffs. It looks at the ways in which, or it looks at the valuation of deviations from a reference point, which could be, let's say, the current level of wealth or the current level of resources. It incorporates the results on nonlinear probability weighting, specifically overweighting of small probabilities, underweighting of large probabilities, and then at the extremes, both the possibility effect and the certainty effect. It incorporates loss aversion, that is that losses loom larger than gains. People, the subjective impact of losses is larger than for gains. And there is a simple way of assessing loss aversion whereby you say, all right, we're going to toss a fair coin, and if the fair coin lands tails, you are going to pay me £100. The question is, how much do you need me to pay you when the coin lands heads for you to be just willing to accept that wager? And the result from the literature, the psychology literature, and the behavioral economics literature is that this ratio of how much on the loss relative to on the gain is about 2, right? So losses seem to loom about twice as large as gains. There is ambiguity aversion as well as the fourfold pattern of risk aversion. So all of this is packaged inside cumulative prospect theory, and I'm not going to introduce that theory right here beyond saying what it incorporates, because it is in fact the work of an entire week with my microeconomics students to teach them how to incorporate into their thinking this vastly different framework from expected utility or subjective expected utility. So I'm happy for us to discuss more about cumulative prospect theory offline. And furthermore, we want to incorporate into this 2014 model mechanisms of deception and manipulation. How is this implemented? We've just mentioned that these are what are described as peripheral root persuasion methods. So they don't proceed from direct logical argumentation, but instead they proceed from invoking authority, invoking scarcity, invoking social allusions to similarity and identification, to reciprocation, to social proof, to consistency of behavior over time. And largely, there is an attempt in peripheral root persuasion to elicit visceral emotions. And of course, there's a large body of work in psychology that shows that visceral emotions suppress logical thinking processes. Think about the last time you found yourself very, very hungry. Hunger triggers a variety of symptoms, irritability being one of them, but impatience is another. And when you're truly hungry, you really don't care where you get the food from. You just want the food. So there's a shortcut there past a lot of logical thinking and incremental thinking to just securing the outcome. It focuses attention on securing outcomes rather than the procedural correctness or the logical correctness of acting at the time. Urgency is another time pressure. Time urgency is another factor that really reduces, it reduces the opportunity to engage in slow, methodical, logical thinking, but it also has an emotional component, which, like other visceral emotions, it actually suppresses the urge or suppresses the ability to think in a logical, consistent manner. So we want to be able to integrate not only peripheral persuasion features into this model, but also cumulative prospect theory. And I've just jumped now to the characterization. Once it's done, this is a mathematical exercise. I direct you to the paper if you're interested in it. But the finding that I obtain is that, and the high level finding, general level finding, is that if with prospect theory based signal detection, the inferential thresholds are more conservative than in classical signal detection theory, meaning that the inferential threshold is farther in the tail than under classical signal detection theory. And this difference between classical signal detection and prospect theory signal detection theory entails that the bias of incorrectly assuming normative rationality is larger for agents with a lower D prime or a lower ROC curvature and area under the curve. Now, this is terminology that is found quite widely in classification mathematics. It's referred to also in machine learning. But essentially, the question is how far is the distribution, the sampling distribution under the null, how far is that separated from the sampling distribution under the alternative hypothesis? So the more separation there is between these two distributions, the larger D prime is. D prime is literally the normalized distance between the means of those two sampling distributions. But also, the larger that distance, the greater the area under the curve of what's called the receiver operating characteristics curves, which some of you may recognize. But because of the more conservative nature of signal detection theory. It actually moves the inferential threshold more for individuals who have a lower D prime. And who will have a lower D prime, who will have less separation between those sampling distributions? Well, it will be those people who are particularly affected by deception ploys and peripheral route persuasion. Okay? So the way I've implemented this integration is that the objective function is characterized or is substituted with cumulative prospect theory, but this idea of peripheral route persuasion affecting the outcome is implemented by essentially distorting the distance of, or the amount of separation that is possible, that the individual achieves between the sampling distribution under the norm, under the null, and under the alternative. So the psychology of deception magnifies the effect of behavioral decision-making under risk and uncertainty. Are there any questions? Should I pause at this time? Or
No, it's nice. Let you have sufficient time before you, if you need it. Let
okay,
us look further and
let's progress. Let's progress.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So just to move this forward a little bit, I've done some simulation work with this, comparing three different models: the classical SDT model, the prospect theory augmented STD model, as well as the model that's augmented not only with prospect theory, but with the psychology of deception. I do some agent-based modeling, and I simulate a 3-week spear phishing attack on an organization with 100 users, and each week those 100 people receive 1 out of 250 emails that is malicious, and during an attack, a user may be fooled at most once. That is, they learn from their mistakes. So we're not making unreasonable assumptions. And the results are displayed on this slide. That essentially the M0 model, with which is classical signal detection theory, yields a fairly concentrated distribution of security breaches per 3-week spear phishing campaign. And the prospect theory augmented model shifts that to the right. And when augmenting further with behavioral effects associated with deception, we also get an enhancement of that even more, and that is in the blue distribution and CDF. So we get a substantial shift both from prospect theory and yet a further distortion at the high end in the upper tail, resulting from the psychology of deception. So the conclusion from this is that individual behavioral level effects matter for system level risk. So that is one modeling framework that we developed. But what is a little bit unsatisfactory from a modeling standpoint is that the effects in the signal detection theory model are commingled. Everything, all the various effects get expressed through the location of the classification threshold. So it's difficult to separate out the various effects in a way that would be trackable at the individual level. So to begin to chip away at that and try to be a little bit more clear on what behavior or what factor is at play in each case, we developed a further model that has a bit of a pun at the beginning. Many fish in the sea. I'm grateful to my co-author Ian Embry for allowing me to name it in such a perhaps unserious manner. But the serious title is in the subtitle, or that is the coexisting choice criteria model of security behavior. So the point of this model is to recognize that there are different ways of thinking. Now, some of you might be aware of research and a book published by Danny Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. So this is a popularization of work that's been done in psychology on what's called dual process theory that differentiates between fast, intuitive responses that are often, characterized as fight or flight responses that would be possibly referred to as the reptilian brain, differentiating those from slower, more deliberate, logical thinking processes that have, in an evolutionary sense, developed in humans much later. So Danny Kahneman's work focused on this partition into thinking fast versus thinking slow. And so what we want to do in this paper, in this piece of research, is consider a set of choice criteria or ways of choosing, ways of making a decision that at least include two categories, but in fact, we want to look at 4 different categories. So this diagram, this figure is read from the right-hand side rather than the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have deliberative, a deliberative state of mind or deliberative way of making a decision. And when in a deliberative state of mind, there are 2 possibilities. You can either decide to click on the link, or you can decide to quarantine. Under a behavioral model, such as cumulative prospect theory, we can also end up with clicking or quarantining. Neither is ruled out. But you do so within a heuristics and biases framework represented by cumulative prospect theory. Then you have an impulsive state of mind, as influenced by visceral emotions that we discussed in connection with the previous paper. Visceral emotions of fear, of time pressure, perhaps of greed, that can be conveyed in the types of emails, phishing emails that organizations receive all the time. And finally, there is a routine state of mind, which really gets that mode of processing email that is prevalent by efficient people in efficient organizations. That is, if you happen to if you receive an email from your boss that purports to be from your boss, you click on that link. If you receive an email from someone else in your organization and you recognize the name or passes some very simple feasibility threshold, you click on that link. Okay, and so you'll notice that both for the impulsive state of mind and the routine state of mind, there is no quarantine choice. Once you're in that state of mind, you're behaving in that manner, okay, without quarantine. And notice the edges between the sort of the diamond circle at the top and the boxes containing routine, impulsive behavior, deliberative states of mind. Those pi symbols represent probabilities. So that pi 1 is the probability with which the individual selects into a deliberative state of mind. Pi superscript 2 is the probability with which the individual selects himself into a behavioral state of mind, and so on for the remaining branches. And at the bottom of this, we have true negatives, false negatives, true positives, false positives. We have the benefits and costs, just like in signal detection theory, all the 4 different classification possibilities. Okay, so that's the structure of the model. And we do quite a lot of mathematical modeling to generate this. And on this slide, I detail what is contained in each one of the ways of thinking or ways of deciding that I pictured on the previous slide. So I've already characterized that verbally. I won't read through this, but they're there for your reference purposes if you would like to consult them later date. So what do we learn from a purely mathematical evaluation of this model? Well, that highly routinized, efficient practices actually can increase vulnerability, okay? And that it's vital that organizational culture supports precautionary verification steps. And so this brings in the idea that information security officers should actually have some role in determining organizational culture and practices around what is seemingly annoying, seemingly wasteful of time, precautionary verification steps. Secondly, that due to the structure of this setup of this model and the presence of routine and impulsive states of mind, routine and impulsive ways of making a decision, with non-zero probabilities of ending up in those states of mind, and states of mind that can be altered by the nature of the email, right? So it is indeed possible to induce some time pressure on the individual, an urgency on the individual, simply by what is communicated in the email. It is possible to induce a certain some other visceral emotions simply by what content is included in the email. And similarly, it's possible to mask a malicious email, make it look like it appears from someone in the organization. Spoofing is the technical term that technologists like to use about that. So given that these options 3 and 4 exist, and given that the probability of ending up at one of those states of mind can be influenced by the attacker, right? It's rational, at least as we in the modeling that we did, given the parameters that we're using, it's rational for the attackers actually to concentrate on C3 and C4. And hence, in terms of implications for organizations, it really is a good idea to focus training on reducing routine responses and reducing impulsive responses. And in this connection, we actually created an experiment that we ran at Lancaster University. This is a field experiment. We enrolled as potential participants all 15,000 students at Lancaster University. So we randomly allocated 15,000 students to 3 treatment groups. Baseline treatment, which consisted of the standard email security and anti-phishing training, but we also developed 2 alternative training packages. One which was focused on trying to interrupt routine behavior, this TRI, routine interrupt treatment, which had an interactive component, and it was developed by my co-author, Ian Embry, who is a specialist in education, and it was designed to cause the student to slow down, think consciously, and preempt routine and automatic processes of email processing. There was also an impulse interrupt treatment designed to alert the student to those features of an email that aim to elicit visceral emotions and to provide strategies for processing emails to reduce the likelihood of impulsive clicks. This was implemented within the standard training environment that the university provides to all students. And there was a follow-up test that consisted of a landing and introduction page, a consent page, a 6 email test that I will identify on a subsequent slide, and a final outro page. And we also asked the students, how likely would you be to fall for an attack like this in real life? So it was eliciting a confidence statement. So the result of the different email class types that we presented to the students, we had some targeting impulsive response, others targeting routine response, and 2 of which were genuine emails, and the remaining 4 were fake ones, intentionally, or malicious by intention, I think was the correct way to phrase those fake ones. And the results show that this TRI, the routine interruption treatment, was most successful. Okay, we formed a performance score that looked at all the classification outcomes. And we also looked at true positives and true negative classification outcomes separately, as well as confidence. And we find that the TRI treatment had a positive impact on the overall score, a positive impact on the true negative classification success, as well as a reduction in confidence. Okay? So that is what you would hope, right? So that the individual will be making decisions less on confidence and more on the basis of their analytical and reasoning processes in the moment. So participants assigned to the TRI treatment correctly classified nearly 10% more emails than those assigned to the baseline treatment, the standard treatment. And TRI participants identified genuine emails at a much higher rate, 16% higher rate than in the baseline treatment. So that was a success for the routine interrupt treatment, at least. The impulsiveness treatment did not prove as successful. So there are gains to be had from having a representation, a mental model of individuals' decision-making as passing through, or not passing through, as taking place in different states of mind: deliberative, behavioral, impulsive, and routine. And so we conclude that working practices in most commercial, voluntary, and public sector organizations presume that email attachments are benign when sent from within the organization. And perhaps this is something that really needs to be addressed. And at least our treatment, our training package seemed to be able to, not seemed, the evidence shows that our training package actually managed to improve performance, specifically with regard to this tendency to work in a routinized, automatic manner. The final paper, if we have time, concerns system-level risk, or systemic risk at the nation-state level. And I have only a few slides for this, so I think I will push through to the end of this slide pack. So this was a collaboration between 3 individuals: myself, Dan Prince, and Henry Warren, who was the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer at the Bank of England at the time, and we managed to publish this in the Quarterly Bulletin of the Bank of England. Now, from a regulator standpoint, from the Bank of England's standpoint, systemic risk has a very specific interpretation that is not shared more widely within society. I think more widely within society, anytime you have a part of national critical infrastructure that is not able to operate at full capacity. So let's say a communications network. If a communications network goes down for a period of time, if it's brought down by a cyber attack, I think technologists would say that, well, this was a systemic event. From the standpoint of the Bank of England and its regulatory purview over the financial sector, a systemic event or a systemic impact has to include substantial reduction of GDP or of economic activity and recession. So it's not just that there was an interruption of service, but this interruption of service then needs to have economic impact more widely across society. And because of this fairly narrow definition, there is persistent disagreement among researchers and academics about whether cyber attacks can in fact constitute more than triggers of systemic events, but in fact causes of systemic crises. So there is widespread agreement that cyber attacks can be the triggers for systemic crises, but triggers that unleash underlying pent-up misvaluations or underlying tensions and aberrations of some kind. Trigger, not cause. And so in this paper, we're addressing this question. Can a cyber attack constitute the cause of a systemic crisis more than merely its trigger? Now, so far, and in the abstract of this paper, it is mentioned that there are no current examples of systemic cyber risk crystallizing and impacting the real economy. But this does not prove an absence of risk. And what I want to do in these remaining few slides is just go through several examples of cases that can help us understand whether cyber attacks can be not only the triggers, but also the causes. And the first of these that I want to examine occurred in 2014. It was the Bank of England's real-time gross settlement systems outage that took place in October 2014 and lasted for 9 hours. So technically, it resulted from a routine updating of CHAPS configuration, but then it had a wider impact, causing the whole real-time gross settlement system to shut down. And with great effort, it was stood back up. It got back up and running only now 9 hours later. And it resulted in substantial delays to the execution of these large value denominated transfers and payments. And from the Deloitte study of that event, we have this slide, which shows that with delay from 6 a.m. through to 3 p.m. We had a delay on the 20th of October, but then fairly quickly that day, and then in some cases the day after, all the payment instructions that were meant to be processed got processed. So it was delay rather than termination of activity. And so the question is, well, did that cause a substantial economic loss that would warrant calling this a systemic event, as the Bank of England classifies them? Notice that this did not result from a cyber attack. This resulted from a technical sort of updating exercise that did not go as planned. But you could imagine very well that a cyber attack that achieved this, a 9-hour outage of real-time gross settlement, would be extremely embarrassing and would be considered a success by the perpetrators of that attack. But what was the final outcome of this? Well, to quantify this, there were only 9 individuals who submitted claims. Okay? Out of 36 who had inquired. And the total cost, the total direct loss that was reimbursed was of the order of £4,000. So that doesn't sound like a systemic economy-wide loss that one should really be concerned about. Of course, there were the indirect losses, all those individuals and all those resources that had to be called in and put to work in order to successfully get RTGS back up and running 9 hours later. So there were substantial costs there, on the order of hundreds of thousands of pounds, certainly. But this was not, did not lead to trillions of losses for the UK economy. So this example suggests that, well, simple delays won't, on their own, if they're not coordinated with other actions, if they don't have, if the scenario that we're painting isn't far more elaborate, merely outage of real-time gross settlement, which is a potential objective of a cyber attack, that in itself does not cause the kind of losses that the Bank of England would really be concerned about on a systemic level. Let's consider another case, the 2016 Bangladesh bank cyber heist, where cyber attackers gained access to the Bangladesh Central Bank and their account with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and they targeted $1 billion in US assets belonging to Bangladesh, and they were successfully able to exfiltrate 81 million of that to various banks in the Philippines, and from there to extract that via casinos in the Philippines. What was the outcome? What was the overall economic impact of that? Well, there was the loss of the 81 million, but beyond that, there wasn't substantial long-lived recession in Bangladesh caused by it. No noticeable recession. So on this occasion, where it was caused by an actual cyber attack, again, we did not see the kind of systemic crisis that would meet the Bank of England's definition of what is required for a systemic crisis. But we also want to look at one further example, the Bulgarian bank runs of 2014. How was this achieved? This was achieved by social media campaigns on Facebook. So these were social engineering attacks that caused fear and anxiety among the population of depositors, the customers of these two banks, KTB and FIB. And this caused an actual bank run. Bank runs are, by definition, systemic events. And the Bulgarian National Bank had to provide a subsidy to the banks, had to take over and administer one of the banks for a long period of time. Bulgaria had to put together a separate application to the European Commission to allow an exception under EU state aid rules to make the transfers to the banks to keep them running. So this definitely was a crisis a systemic event, caused significant budgetary hit and a loss of confidence. So notice that where availability of a service or access to funds or access to a transfer service, financial transfer service, where availability is being targeted, as was the case in the first two examples that I gave, there isn't the kind of systemic event in evidence. But where integrity is attacked, in the Bulgarian case, integrity of the financial stability, financial viability of the two banks in question, where that was attacked, that indeed led to a knee-jerk reaction by the customers to pull their money, to create bank runs in actual fact. So that was a successful perception of integrity attack, and that seems to be the direction in which we should be looking if we want to understand cyber attacks and cyber attacks as leading to systemic events. Okay, and it's with that I think I will end this formal part of the presentation and turn the microphone back to Philippe and Zayin.
Thank you so much, Kim. It was very interesting. I don't want, of course, to summarize what you said because I will do it probably wrongly, but I think it's very interesting. You had, from my point of view, three very interesting points. The first one is behaviors. What are the behaviors? And especially opposing CPT, SDT behavior and classical SDT, and the conclusion that deception magnifies the effects, which is very important. Then changing behavior strategy, maybe a conclusion which is not straightforward, that is acting more on routine behaviors than on impulsive behavior. We will have said the opposite, and therefore it's very interesting, and especially interesting from an insurance and reinsurance contract where you insist on how to give sufficient incentive to precaution. Then, of course, your first question is, what is precaution? What is the priority concerning precaution is important. And then lastly, but here we should maybe be relatively cautious concerning our systemic risk, because systemic risk is not something we are seeing every day. And therefore, we are probably looking at a short period of time considering what is the systemic risk, where probably we should at least refer to 2008 and 1929. Maybe there are other more localized systemic risks and not globalized systemic risks. Nevertheless, I see that it's not as evident as we would have said that cyber risk is systemic as such. We think immediately of systemicity because of the interconnection, the interconnected world, and therefore systemicity is very easy to think about from that point of view. But there you just mentioned how reactive are people, and therefore maybe we have to be cautious when we raise this question of systemicity, or at least to think more about. And I should not use an argument of authority that is publishing in the Bank of England quarterly bulletin, which I am reading each quarter. That is, of course, a source of authority, because from an institution that is in charge of course, fighting against systemic risk is of course, to be considered as very important. Maybe before leaving the floor to the participant, just one question. How much can we go, from your point of view, beyond what you have described, and especially the theoretical model you have been developing in the first part of your presentation, from theory to empirics? Because there, of course, for an insurer, we are concerned by two facts: which kind of cyber risk we should accept to cover, first point, and with which prices. And both are, of course, highly dependent from what we have described in the first part of your presentation. Therefore, I take the other parts, the behavioral description and the strategies and the systemics, are more kind of illustration of different dimensions.
So thank you very much, Peter. So I mentioned this distinction between ensemble average-based calculations versus time average-based calculations, and bringing this back round to uninsurability due to climate risk. I realize we're talking about, I'm veering off cybersecurity right now, but this theme is, I think, is particularly important in the context of climate risk, because, of course, and there's a parallel, right? For cyber risk, there are only a few limited number of contracts that are available now that have been successfully developed. So the remainder is uninsurable. So there's an uninsurability question there, and especially it's very visible, and it's easy to count the number of houses in the United States that have become uninsurable. So it's more salient. It sort of pops out more clearly to us. But both are examples of uninsurability. And the fact being that, of course, the price of insuring has risen to the point where customers are no longer willing to pay, or unable to pay. And my thought there is that that if it's possible for the customers themselves to adopt a time average view of the risk they're facing, that will, in the first instance, cause them to I don't want to say become more risk averse. That's technically incorrect, but they would be evaluating the risk in a way that will lead them to be willing to pay higher insurance premiums. I think that's the first component of it. And the second is that it leads to the possibility that there can be bundling of risk in different ways than is currently the case. And so, just as a toy model, as a toy illustration, you might want to have bundling of risk. So imagine you have a house on the side of the valley and a house at the top of the valley. So the one at the top of the valley is exposed to wind and hurricane. The one on the side of the valley is not. So you might want to have bundling of the risks across such categories, not only by the insurers, but in order to in order to allow the customers to be able to afford the risk, if that bundling could be implemented on the customer side or by the insurance company on behalf of the customer. So that is my thought there. And with regard specifically to cyber risk, it's so complicated at the moment. It is so complicated with all those externality patterns and the moral hazard elements that it's difficult to really to identify exactly how the path forward. But this idea of allowing the bundling of risk, right, and diversification of risk at the customer's site, if you like, If a farm would not only be in the valley or on the valley side, but if it would have one part of the farm at the top of the valley, on the plateau or on the plain, and on the side, then that farm would enjoy internal diversification, which therefore allow it to take on direct insurance more readily. So these are the sort of thoughts. They're quite high level implications, to be honest, rather than very detailed level ones. Philippe, I hope I've answered.
No. You have answered and then raised two questions, but then just to remark, the first one, of course, diversification is the business of insurance. So as economies of scale is the business of industry, etc. And therefore, we have, of course, to improve each year business diversification, and surely for cyber security, the question, and when we want to ensure cyber risk, the question is, with which kind of risk should we find a diversification source, which is not exactly straightforward, and probably is partly of the difficulty, the current difficulty to implement and to supply covers, cyber security covers, which because we are not totally aware of what are the diversification sources of this risk. Of course, at one point of time, there was the fear of systemicity, which has, for an equivalent, no possibility of diversification by definition, and therefore people just relatively reluctant to insure the biggest risk because fearing it's rather systemic than not. And then, but what you are saying there also, your first remark is very important. The main problem of uninsurability is not exactly the level of the price. Of course, it's an obstacle, but at the end of the game, if you are smart, we may go around. The true problem may be the moral hazard, and it's a point you have been underlying, is that there is a problem of a structural problem of moral hazard, and not clear how much incentive in the contract may solve the problem, which is relatively, of course, part of the question of this business and for insurance, maybe a little less for human resources department, which want to improve the level of alert of the employees, but surely from a point of view of an insurers and reinsurers, that is not able to fully control the behavior of the clients, and especially of the employees of the clients. But maybe I can look at our question, please. We have very, very few minutes because we are normally at the end of the presentation, which will not take too much time. Yes, I see someone. It's Irene. Irene, please, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. So thank you, Kai, for the presentation. It was very packed, so I wished it to be a three-part series, actually, to have a bit more time in each of the topics. A quick question. At SCOR, we are currently considering to put quantum computing on our internal risk radar. And we were wondering about suitable scenarios about a malicious actor getting the capability to covertly decrypt financial transactions. Is this something you've looked into? Would that be lending itself to the modelization in the first part you mentioned?
So, I mean, this is an area that that I think that it's an area of interest. Whether we have developed the models yet to really crack it, aside from a fairly, I don't want to say superficial level, right? There's the superficial level that says, oh, with quantum computing, nothing is secure and therefore it all falls apart. So to go beyond that initial surface level, I don't think we've really hit on very many excellent sort of frameworks. And there is a similarity there with our concern about generative AI and its ability to really be much more productive and effective in breaking down and breaking through firewalls and human security protocols. So I think there are these parallel sort of modeling challenges, and I don't think we yet have the kind of the core of a model that allows us to do much more beyond that very basic level. But I certainly will reconsult my information sources about what exactly is the latest development in the last 6 months.
Yeah, that would be appreciated. Yeah, I'd like to siphon off as much information as we can on that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ida.
Thank you so much. Are there other questions, please? Phil, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yep, thank you, Kim.
Hi.
Fascinating stuff. I must admit, I was hanging on. If it was just reading it, I'd be hanging on by my fingertips to some of the formula. But with the narrative and the explanation behind it, it comes across very, very clearly. A bit taken towards the end. So we had a lot of focus on, for instance, like the email piece, which is maybe quite a common thread where people would think that's the avenue into an organization if something's coming through externally. And that reads across well to the behavioral type stuff in terms of being prompted to do something quickly. You know, you have your online banking and you put a transaction through, and they'll always be saying, "Oh, are you being rushed to do this unduly quickly?" All this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And then towards the end, within some of the examples, they then seem somewhat extraneous. So if you're then talking about the perception piece, that's much more difficult for an entity to get to grips with, because that's happening out with your organization.
Yes.
So it hasn't even got to the point of trying to get in through the door. So would they become more common lines of attack if the companies are generally getting better at defending within their own organization? You know, we have training programs where we get sent sample phishing things to see if we're on our game, you know.
I think the difference is the organization's own kind of internal risk and versus the systemic risk. So Bank of England, central banks view systemic risk as a kind of cascading risk across the sector. So where you can have contagion that proceeds by way of information in the public media, in social media, but also then through balance sheet effects. Sort of, you know, one firm sort of collapsing, that having balance sheet implications for those firms it's connected to, and therefore you get these concentric circles, these ripple effects going through the economy. And it's those ripple effects that the central bank is particularly interested in. So yes, you're right to notice that the discontinuity, the modeling framework and the objective, as it were, is different within the firm, within the organization versus the systemic component. And it's a public good question. So the integrity of communication on social media is a public good. You know, if there are rumors being spread, that affects everyone. You can't exclude yourself from it. It has different properties. It's part of you know, the nation's, if you might call it, information infrastructure, if you like, the public infrastructure for transmitting information. That doesn't belong to the individual firm, and the firm can't control it, exactly as you pointed out.
Yeah. And even when there's been some examples, so you follow them to a degree, a Jaguar Land Rover would have been one, and the companies themselves then probably, once something's happened, they're not really shouting from the rooftops in terms of how that has come about. They just, there's an outage, their production lines are down, and it's substantial sums of money.
Yep.
But unless you're in the line and there's an insurance claim coming through, you don't really get that intel. You maybe get examples of it years later within these types of things where a bit of information creeps out.
Yes. So with regard to Jaguar Land Rover, and so now I see a kind of a possibility to unite an answer both to you as well as to Philippe's earlier comments, that it does occur to me that, well, the standard economic way of dealing with externalities is to try to internalize them, right? So, in a different context, monopoly has certain effectiveness in internalizing externalities it causes. And so here I went through a list of different externalities from a firm to other firms in its same supply chain, from a firm to the sector. Now, potentially, one way of eliminating some of these effects, internalizing some of these effects, and eliminating the associated moral hazard questions would be to be able to focus insurance products that cover not only one firm in the supply chain, but the entire supply chain itself. So I don't actually know whether insurance products exist for a supply chain or for the cybersecurity of a supply chain. But from an economic theory standpoint, that would be a solution to the question of how do you deal with those within supply chain externalities.
I suppose the closest analogy maybe I could quickly come up with, you get various pooling. So eventually people realize nuclear is too tricky. Terrorism in the UK was the same. So you get a pooling system set up.
Yeah. With a certain amount of government support behind it.
Just a bit.
Yes. Which incidentally, if I get on my soapbox right now and I have the time to do it, if I do, flood RE in the UK I think it's due to run until 2037, and there's no plan for a continuation beyond that. But of course, while flood RE is in operation, it means that individual households in flood-prone areas in the UK don't have an incentive to change their behavior. They don't have a incentive to protect themselves against flood, to move out of those flood zones, or to build better. So the pooling also has follow-on incentive effects, and at least with regard to flood RE, it's not a moral hazard, but it is a directly resulting from the flood RE program that you don't see a lot of movement in terms of physically altering the structures or moving to places where those flood risks don't exist. So yeah, so thanks for letting me stand on that soapbox.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kim, for your answer. And of course, we are sharing your answer, especially we are aware that public pooling can be very dangerous in that it destroys any incentives in favor of good behaviors and just leaving the public sector, of course, paying for you and not asking you to do the minimum needed change in behavior that will, of course, help control the risk. And it's important. Maybe I am sorry, I am sure there are other questions, but here I have a commitment to everyone to stop. No, because we are beyond the time, the forecasted and expected timing. And I would like firstly and mostly thank Kim for his presentation. I have to apologize because for a reason I don't know, my camera is no more functioning suddenly, and therefore it's not because I want to hide myself, but it's because of technical reason I will have to work out. But thank you so much, Kim. It was very interesting, very stimulating, and I think it has given us, especially for those who are working on how to cover the cyber risk, but also even in the human resource department of the company, giving a lot of ideas of what we can do or what are the point of attentions And really, it was a highly stimulating presentation on a topic which is currently very hot. Thank you very much, Kim, and thank you to all auditors and also who have been connecting. And I say good afternoon for those who are European, and for the other, good night or good morning. Bye-bye. And
Thank you
all
very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thanks a lot.
everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks,
Cheers.
Eden.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
And thank you, Philip. And thank you, Zain. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.